When my father passed away, he left me the family house, but after his death, my mother moved me out to live with her new family. At just 7 years old, I was deeply affected by the loss of my dad, with whom I shared many precious memories. The situation worsened when my mother quickly introduced a new man into our lives, insisting I call him Dad shortly after my father's death. This didn't sit well with me at all. As my mother and her new husband prepared for their wedding, which was notably elaborate for a second marriage, they made the decision to move me to my grandparents' house permanently. My mother left for her honeymoon and did not return for me, instead eventually showing up just to leave my belongings there, effectively abandoning me with my grandparents. Despite her occasional visits claiming love and concern, the real reason became clear later on. She needed my room for her stepchildren from her new husband, John. Growing up with my grandparents, who were truly my saviours, I managed to lead a happy life despite the circumstances. After graduating high school and spending a year working in product marketing manager, I decided to start my own business, which meant I needed capital. It was then that I planned to lease out my inherited home, the very house my mother and her new family were living in. Unbeknownst to them, my father had left the house solely to me in his will. His last-minute decision had clearly been a shock to my mother, indicated by her reaction during the reading of the will. At 27, feeling both legal and moral ownership over my childhood home, I decided it was time to reclaim it. Facing resistance and threats from my mother's family, I involved the police to assert my rights. This action marked a significant step in taking back what was rightfully mine, not just for financial reasons, but as a final assertion of my father's wishes. Over time, I learned that my mother had made multiple attempts to contest my father's will, but was unsuccessful each time. My father had crafted the will with such precision that the house was unequivocally left to me, with the condition that I could only sell it after reaching the age of 26. Before then, the property was to remain untouched. My grandparents believed that my father had anticipated my mother's intentions, which is why he had established such a firm will to prevent any potential manipulation during my childhood. Recently, I decided to generate some income by leasing the house. I tried to discuss this plan with my mother, but she did not respond to my calls. During a visit with my grandparents, I shared my intentions, only to be met with a strange reaction. They warned me that my mother and her new family might resist vacating the house, especially since her stepdaughter was expecting a child with a teenage boy who had abandoned his responsibilities. Additionally, John, her husband, had been laid off and was only able to find part-time work. This left them in a precarious financial state. Feeling uncertain about how to proceed, I considered the fact that I too needed the house, now that I had quit my job to start my own business. My grandparents explained that my mother and her family were struggling, which might make them reluctant to leave my property. Initially, I thought about giving them a month's notice, but given their circumstances, I opted to extend it to 4 0R5 months. Since my mother was unresponsive over the phone, I decided to visit her in person. The house had changed, and so had she. Both exuded a chilly aura. Her reaction to my arrival was lukewarm at best, offering a forced smile and a tepid hug. This was our first meeting in nearly 10 years. She had stopped visiting after I became a teenager, and our relationship had soured. Despite the years apart, she showed no interest in catching up or inquiring about my life. It seemed she only cared because my visit suggested an urgent matter. I played it down, saying I just wanted to check in after such a long time. Following a brief and awkward silence, I left, feeling distinctly unwelcome. Even my pregnant stepsister seemed to regard me with suspicion, as though I was there to cause trouble. For the moment, I shaped the idea of reclaiming the house and looked for alternative ways to fund my business. However, my mother's behaviour reached a new low last week, on the 19th anniversary of my father's death. My grandparents organised a small prayer ceremony at the church, and since I was in town, I decided to honour my father by feeding the poor and giving gifts to underprivileged children. I invited friends and family, including my mother, but she ignored the invitation. When I checked the email trail, I discovered my first attempt to reach out to my mother via email had seemingly failed. She hadn't even opened the message. Concerned it might have landed in her spam folder, I decided to visit her home once more. This time, however, she wasn't there. My stepsister Mia answered the door with no pleasantries, immediately confronting me with, "You're back again? What's the matter?" I explained that I had come to personally invite our mother to a prayer ceremony for my late father. Mia dismissively laughed and said, "That was ages ago, get over it." Taken aback by her rudeness, I retorted, "Excuse me, he was my dad. It's not your place to make such comments." She just rolled her eyes and disappeared into her room. Feeling foolish for even trying, I left a note on the table asking my mother to call me. She did call the next day, but when I spoke about the prayer ceremony, she quickly dismissed the idea, claiming she had to take Mia for a checkup. Her outright refusal, without even a pretense of willingness to attend, stung. I sarcastically responded, "Sure, they're your priority. We mean nothing to you. Good luck with raising that narcissistic woman and her child." Her outrage at my words was swift. She defended Mia and criticised me for being insensitive, especially in front of a pregnant woman. She then insulted my father, claiming I was just like him. Losing my temper, I countered that she had no right to malign my father. She coldly mentioned that he had been gone for 19 years and suggested I move on. Infuriated, I ended the call abruptly, saying that my father wouldn't have appreciated her prayers anyway after seeing her true nature. The same day, I decided enough was enough and contacted a lawyer to begin the eviction process from the house my father had left me. It took the lawyer about 3 weeks to confirm the details of my father's will and send an eviction notice to my mother. She was shocked, clearly not expecting me to take such drastic measures over her failure to attend the ceremony. She tried to reach me, but finding herself blocked, she turned up at my grandparents' home instead. By then, I had moved back in with my grandparents to sort out my life. My mother tried to persuade them to intervene on her behalf regarding the eviction notice. Despite their gentle nature, my grandparents stood firm, explaining that the decision was mine alone and that they had no influence over it. Her frustration was evident as she accused them of spoiling me, leaving us all astounded by her audacity. It was clear that, despite everything, the situation had escalated far beyond what any of us could have anticipated. I confided in my grandma about my frustration that she hadn't confronted my manipulative mum. My grandparents explained they preferred not to engage with such a toxic person. I, however, was determined not to let my mother and her family stay in my house any longer than necessary. I issued an eviction notice according to the tenant laws of the country. Technically, they weren't even tenants, since they never paid rent, while I was stuck paying the property taxes each year. My grandparents, being deeply religious and compassionate, urged me to reconsider for the sake of decency and the unborn child in the household. They persuaded me to give them a month to find alternative housing, despite my readiness to evict them immediately. I begrudgingly agreed, respecting their wishes, even though my stepsister had proven just as unpleasant as my mother. The next day, my mother called, but I ignored it, remembering all the times she had ignored me. She messaged me, urgently wanting to talk. I coldly suggested she check my schedule and meet me when I was available at my grandparents' place. She didn't appreciate my formal tone and sent a lengthy reply accusing me of being overbearing. I didn't bother to respond, making it clear I wasn't going to succumb to her pressure tactics. Throughout my childhood, whenever I showed emotion or frustration, her approach was to scold rather than to comfort, teaching me to suppress my feelings to keep the peace. Now, it was her turn to experience frustration, except she wouldn't have the comfort of a familiar home to retreat to soon. When she came to meet me, I deliberately kept her waiting to unsettle her. My grandparents stayed out of the confrontation. When we finally met, she tried to maintain a stoic demeanour, stating we needed to resolve this quickly as she had other important things to do. I sarcastically noted that finding a new home must indeed be challenging. She angrily questioned the eviction notice, to which I retorted that it was clearly written in English, implying she should be able to understand it without my help. Infuriated, she threw the notice at me, refusing to leave the house and threatening legal action. I remained calm, challenging her to face the legal consequences if she chose to ignore the court order. Her audacity peaked when she referred to my father as her husband, despite having dismissed his memory so callously before. I couldn't hold back my anger and told her she didn't deserve to live in his house after neglecting his legacy so blatantly. She warned that she would get her lawyer involved. I laughed it off, reminding her we still had 10 days until the eviction deadline, curious what she would attempt next. The eviction process was fraught with tension. She tried to manipulate the situation, but I firmly shut down her attempts. In a desperate move, her stepdaughter Mia even threatened to file a harassment claim against me, using her pregnancy as leverage. I made it clear that her condition did not give her the right to cause trouble or evade responsibility. Living with my grandparents, I had installed cameras around the house for security. This came in handy when Mia, my stepsister, tried to confront me again. I firmly told her that if she stepped on the property without permission, I would have her arrested. My mother then came to Mia's defence, accusing me of mentally abusing and torturing her pregnant daughter and threatening to sue me. I confidently referred to the camera footage and suggested we let a judge decide. My mother's tactics then shifted from aggression to self-pity. She began to cry, questioning what she had done wrong in raising me that I had become so self-centered. She even blamed my deceased father, claiming his early death was why I hadn't been brought up properly. I stopped her there, correcting her that I was raised by my grandparents, not her, and they had done a fantastic job. I pointed out the irony in her self-pity, noting how poorly she had raised her own stepdaughter. In the heat of the moment, I mentioned Mia's teenage pregnancy, an outburst I immediately regretted, but by then, her fury was palpable. After calming down, I made it clear that I no longer wished to engage in pointless discussions. I simply wanted my property back. I explained that I had quit my job to start a business and needed to lease the house for income. She became upset at the notion of strangers living there, even though they would be paying tenants. I countered that she could stay if she paid rent, which only increased her agitation. She accused me of prioritising money over family, to which I replied that there was no family in our relationship. She had neglected me during every important moment of my life, making her rare appearances feel more obligatory than genuine. She attempted every manipulation tactic, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, anger, but I was unmoved. Contrary to what others might think, this did not lead to her vacating the house. Her husband then became involved, sending me a threatening voicemail bragging about his physical strength and warning me against pursuing the eviction. I took his voicemail as a direct threat and didn't engage further, preferring to let law enforcement handle it. On the eviction day, I went to the police station with my lawyer to report the threats and request an escort for the eviction. Initially, the police were hesitant, suggesting they'd come only if there was trouble, but a little persuasion and they agreed to accompany us. When we arrived, my mother, John and Mia started cursing at us. John even came out wielding a hockey stick, but he retreated when he saw the police car. The cops presented the eviction notice and ordered them to leave. Confidently, they asked for another month to pack up and leave, but after all the threats and disrespect, I was firm in my decision. When they tried to use Mia's pregnancy to gain sympathy and a few extra days, I insisted on a strict time frame of 5 hours. This decision might have seemed harsh to the observing officers, but I was determined to follow through legally, without bending to emotional blackmail. John's last-ditch effort to intimidate us fizzled out in the presence of the police, marking the end of their resistance. After the tense eviction, the police demanded that the keys be handed over at the station, where I would later pick them up. We compensated the officers for their extra help, a price I was more than willing to pay to avoid any further confrontation with my former house occupants. My lawyer recommended obtaining a restraining order against them to prevent any potential harassment towards me or any future tenants, given their track record of disruptive behaviour. The police issued the restraining order, clearly explaining the legal ramifications should they choose to violate it. Their dismay was evident, and with that, I finally regained control over my property. I've since put the house up for lease, eager to secure a good tenant and begin funding my new business venture.